Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me alright. This is all working today, like it wasn't so much over the weekend. Trouble with doing the late shows, which I have done while I've been alone the last couple of weeks, is that you talk about the news and it hasn't necessarily changed that much by Monday. So let's just go with what's interesting anyway. What has been going on is the Labour Party conference, so a lot of kind of parochial British politics, but some of it is an opportunity to talk about other things, I suppose. Well, you know the score. These things always get demonetized. This new streaming channel isn't monetized at all, really, in the first place. So please do subscribe, because this is a different channel to my normal one. So I appreciate it very much if you do that. And yeah, if you feel so inclined, drop a tip in the jar. Subscribe to me on Patreon, Subscribestar, preferably Subscribestar. You know the spiel by now. Every YouTuber does it. Right, I am in the hole a little bit at the moment due to unexpected car repairs, so any assistance would be greatly appreciated. But yeah, let's get on with it, shall we? So, Thomas Cook has collapsed. I think I reported on Saturday night, which is when I did my late night show. I think I reported about that then. Thomas Cook is an old school sort of travel store company, package holidays, that sort of thing. Pretty out of date in the age of the internet, when you can do all this kind of stuff pretty easily online, or for yourself relatively easily and cheaper than going through people like that. So little surprise really, but what's caused them to collapse is a cash squeeze. So they were still able to operate under normal conditions, but they've been a bit squeezed, shall we say. So yeah, they've gone bankrupt. They've ceased trading. Bailout talks didn't really go anywhere. I imagine the government's been rather preoccupied with Brexit and so on. So a lot of people have been stranded or have had their breaks away cancelled, they won't necessarily get their money back. And it means a big operation has been launched to bring a whole bunch of British holidaymakers home. So 150,000 people that have basically been screwed over by this. And it's not even like particularly peak holiday season at the moment. You know, the kids are back at school now. It's not the time when it would be the worst, but it's still 150,000 people. Thomas Cook also employs 22,000 people worldwide, including 9,000 in the UK, so that's not going to help the employment figures very much. And like I say, it's not a business that really kind of exists really anymore, so people are kind of screwed. But what can you do? The world changes, you can adapt or you can die. I don't think it would have been the right thing to bail them out, but hopefully there's enough money in the pot, there's enough assistance, there's enough leeway to get everyone home. So it's not only 150,000 Britons, but it's about 600,000 people, customers, where they shouldn't be and need to be brought home. Thomas Cook also operates in Germany, that's one of their bigger markets, and their insurance companies are helping to bring people home. So hopefully people with travel insurance will be all right, but we'll see what happens to everyone else. Department for Transport says they'll do what they can to get everyone home. You might have to pay for your own flight and then reclaim the costs later. Don't know if I trust them on that, but that's the idea. So yeah, that's going to be fun for people and ruin a lot of holidays. And yeah, I guess staycations in future, people, because you're not going to be able to go abroad. But don't use these package operators. If you do everything yourself individually, you'll often find that it's cheaper, right, to get the hotels, get everything else. The idea of going through a third party used to be that you could get it cheaper. It's not really the case anymore, provided you shop around and you use your coupons and so on. But this way, you know, if the company goes bust, everything goes bust. Whereas if you book your flights and everything separately, all of those companies would have to go bust to completely disrupt your holiday. So it's more manageable if you don't do that. Excuse me a moment. What have we got next? Oh yes, the Labour Party conference. There's a lot to talk about here. Let me just cluster it all together to get it all out of the way at once. Because they've been promising an awful lot of stuff. Right. I mean, the big story was, when I was reporting on it over the weekend, the big story was that they were trying to orchestrate a sort of internal party coup to remove Tom Watson. Tom Watson's the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Deputy leaders is a relatively new position that was created only a couple of decades ago, I think now. God, I'm old. But even so, and they're just kind of like a fill-in. It's not like a vice president or anything. It's just someone who can do some of the duties of the prime minister and take some of the strain off, and be a slightly different voice towards the head of the party. It's a kind of extra front bench position. They often hold two positions at the same time. It's not really been formalised or anything yet. But Watson has been, to quote the Corbynistas, disloyal to Jeremy Corbyn, because he's been very anti-Brexit and vocal about being anti-Brexit and going on the marches and everything and trying to bend Labour's official policy more to what was promised at the previous conference last time, that they would be more anti-Brexit than they have been. So in many ways, he's actually reflecting the views of Labour voters who are over 60% pro-Remain, and the party, which is something like 70% pro-Remain, and the MPs, which are something like 70-75% pro-Remain. But Corbyn claims to be on the fence, but I think it's pretty clear that he still wants a Brexit, just not the Tories one, unfortunately. So they tried to get rid of Tom Watson, but Corbyn, to his credit, stood by Watson and didn't want internal party divisions. I think it's too late for that. There already are internal party divisions, and this is just like, let's stick something over that and hope it goes away, which it isn't. So they already had a vote at a previous conference to set Labour's policy to be Remain. And that's what they're supposed to have been doing all this time, but they've been fudging and dodging and not following what the party said they should, mostly because of Corbyn's influence and a few other high-profile Lexiters, that's left Brexit, who are in Corbyn's sort of inner circle, I guess. But it looks like the party's going to try and reassert, we want to be a party of Remain, even more strongly at this. But there is a division between them and the hardline Corbyn supporters. I mean, you look at Trump, right, and you look at Boris, and you can say, oh my God, these people are terrible populists. They'll say anything, and their followers are dumb and will just go along with anything that they say. Unfortunately, that's also true to a large extent for Corbyn. Even the slightest criticism is seen as disloyalty or whatever. It's not what our politics, not really what any democratic politics is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be a representative democracy. So you represent the people, not necessarily what they want, but what they need. Because you're supposed to be an expert. You're supposed to study all of these things. You're supposed to figure out what's the best policy, what produces the best outcomes for people. That's what you're supposed to do. Instead, we seem to be caught between two ideological opposites who aren't considering what's best for the country or best for the people, or even necessarily what's best to be elected and stay elected. It seems so ideological, and that's kind of alien. I guess the last time we really felt that was under Thatcher, who was incredibly ideological, and the country suffered a great deal because of it. I don't like either of them, and I think that's causing me to gloss over some of the problems with the Liberal Democrats, because I really think we need a genuine third force in British politics, and I want the politics of coalition to continue, but I'd rather it didn't happen with extremes like the DUP. But so there's ongoing battles within the Labour Party over policy, and Corbyn's sort of momentum supporters, and the Blairite rump that's left, and the moderate Labour people. I mean, I am radically left-wing, but Corbyn makes me uncomfortable because of this cult of personality, and because at the end of the day I want left-wingers to be elected, and I want them to enact policies, and in order to do that you have to compromise to some degree. I don't necessarily see that happening. On the other hand, if Labour fumbles it completely, they'll still get a good turnout at any election, and the Conservatives, even though they are fumbling it, they're still going to get a good turnout at any election. But I don't think either of them is doing well enough to get an overall majority, which means there's hope there for the Liberal Democrats to come in and ally, even though they've said they won't, with one or the other, and force them into a more Remain stance. The Tories aren't going to be forced into a more Remain stance. Labour can be, at least for a second referendum or something. So I guess the ideal outcome to all of this for me would be a Labour Lib Dem government with a reasonably secure majority, with the Lib Dems having a big block of MPs, so that they can really sort of bend Labour in a way that they didn't manage necessarily to bend the Tories when they were in coalition with them, and maybe they'll leverage that for proportional representation rather than alternative vote. They'll leverage that for another referendum. Yeah, we might see some progress there, but Corbyn's believers are still wishy-washy, and that's going to cost them at the ballot box, and it's mostly going to be the Lib Dems who are going to cannibalise the Labour vote, and to a smaller amount the Brexit Party, but they're still unlikely to return any MPs. They might get one. That's being quite generous. But that's all due to the quirks of our system, which is why I hope the Lib Dems get in, so that we can get proportional representation and we can get a more representative parliament, especially since we're now used to coalitions. But it's interesting watching how Brexit has divided and gutted the two main parties, but has brought the Lib Dems back from the dead like a jolt of electricity to the chest. I was waffling a bit there, but never mind. The other thing that's concerning me, a lot of these policies and ideas coming out of Labour and this conference, they're costly, they're expensive. I agree with them for the most part, but I worry if they're things that make them more or less electable. And will people go along with them? I think you need to focus on the few big policies, the few big changes, something like when they brought in the NHS in the post-war era. And I think that's where you need to really focus your effort and not necessarily bring out a whole lot of other radical, expensive, unpopular ideas all at the same time. So, for example, they want to redistribute the assets of private schools. I don't like private schooling. I don't like the way that some kids get a leg up on everyone else. And if what was spent on private schooling went into the public schooling system, one way or another, increased taxes, whatever, do we as a society decide that, okay, we'll pay a little bit more, but we'll get everyone a better education, right? Same thing with health. I mean, our system, you have public healthcare, but you can also top up with private healthcare. Some people in the US don't seem to understand that we have private healthcare alongside public healthcare, and public healthcare makes private healthcare more affordable, right? But how much better would the NHS be if all that money being spent on private healthcare was transferred into public healthcare and made things better for everybody? And similar with education. I don't think either of those policies will wash with the public, but I understand the appeal. They're things I would like to see done, perhaps, but I'm concerned about whether it's electable. So if we remove private schools, if we bring them into the state sector, even if we do it partially, like say you have to have a certain amount of intake that aren't paying, bright pupils from publicly owned schools, things like that, all the way through to possibly just saying, right, no private schools, you're now public schools, tough, suck it up, deal with it. There's a whole raft of stuff that's here possibly. But I would like to see, in some way, private school assets helping everybody rather than just a handful, a select few who then get taught that they're the elite and that they're going to rule the country, which is true in the case of Eton, but that's kind of by the by. So they want to get rid of tax loopholes and things that aid private schools. A lot of it's good. I can agree with a lot of it, but the way the policy is set out just sounds vindictive, which is a problem that does dog left-wing policy. It can often seem like revenge rather than justice, unfortunately, and I don't know whether this will be popular with people. I do want to see an end to faith schools, absolutely, especially since they're using their faith status to teach kids nonsense and to evade the national curriculum. At the moment, there's a big fuss about creationism being taught in schools in Wales at the moment, and it absolutely shouldn't be. It's got no place there whatsoever. That said, I went to a Church of England primary school where we had to do prayers and so on, and sing hymns at assembly, and I credit that quite a lot with my suspicion of religion. Familiarity breeds contempt, so maybe there's something good about being forced to attend religious schools. I don't know. But this the policy seems unclear. It's likely to be unpopular. Even people who can't afford to send their kids to private school might have issues with it. It's just I don't see why they would want to emphasise that so much at the moment when there's we all know what the big issues are at the moment. They've also pledged to stop prescription charges. That's going to increase the costs for the NHS quite a lot. often our prescription charges don't cover our medicines. Sometimes they're more than the cost of the medicines if they're very cheap generics. And it does get expensive if you're unemployed or retired or whatever. But in those instances, we already forgive people their prescriptions. So if you can afford your prescription, your meds, and it's about £9 an item. So what's that current exchange rates? $12 per item, something like that. So I have to get 3, sometimes 4 sets of drugs each month, and that costs me 30 quid odd a month. That's somewhat affordable. I am on benefits, but I don't qualify for the free prescriptions because fuck me, apparently. And it can get to be a bit of a pinch, but I can afford it, and I think if you can afford it, you should pay for it, because that helps bolster and hold up the NHS. And that money's still going to come from somewhere, so again we go back to taxation. How much are we willing to pay in order to shore up the NHS and education and all these other things and make them worthwhile? I would be willing to pay more tax anyway, but this seems like a fiddle around that we don't especially need. So it's a policy that I don't think is particularly necessary, because the structure that we already have in place already protects vulnerable people and the poorest people from having to pay anyway, so I don't see the point, other than it's just a nice sounding thing. And the money's still going to have to come from somewhere, like I say. They've also pledged free personal care for over 65s in England, which is great. We do have a problem with elder care and so on. But the boomers are all heading into homes. They've all retired pretty much. They're not paying into the system anymore. And that's a big bulge of people, even with the attrition that goes on over time. So we're hitting this point where elder care is going to be the biggest and most expensive thing that we have to deal with. And they want to spend a hell of a lot more on it. And there just may not be the money in the coffers to do it. So it's a nice idea, it's a lovely idea. Elder care is something at which we fail at the moment, and private care homes aren't a good way to go about it. A lot of them are very corrupt, and they try and cut corners and save money because they're private enterprises, and as a result, care declines. But where's the money for this going to come from? Especially if Labour still wants some kind of left-wing Brexit, right? Where are these personal carers going to come from? Right, it is a low-paid, really difficult job. It takes a special kind of person to want to get into elderly care. A lot of people take it up because it's the only work around. They don't really want to do it, and they don't provide good quality of care, and that's why you see a lot of elder abuse and so on coming from carers. So you don't need to be especially qualified for some of these positions. So if we're going to give everybody over 65 free personal care if they need it, that's help with dressing, washing and making meals, things like that, right? Where are the people going to come from? Where is the money going to come from? Especially if Labour decides that they still want a Brexit, in which case the economy collapses to one extent or another. Lowest estimate something like 5%, highest estimate something like 12 to 15%. How do we pay for all this? I mean, we did manage to bring the NHS in while we were extremely impoverished and in a post-war society, but the culture was very different then. We'd just come out of the war. We'd been running a planned economy for the war. A lot of countries figured, oh, well, this worked really well for total global conflict. Maybe we can apply these same lessons to peacetime. And that's how we got the NHS and a whole bunch of other things. But it doesn't actually work except in crisis situations. But now people don't expect that from the society. So I don't know that there's the will there to do this. It's not that I don't want elderly people to have care. I do think we need to pay more taxes and so on to do it. I'm just not convinced personal care is practical. You don't get economy of scale when you're talking about individual care. If we increase the number of homes for elderly people who are genuinely struggling, that's a more cost-efficient way of sort of centralising it and getting that economy of scale, whereas personalised care isn't. There was some other stupidity at the Labour conference. Things like women going through the menopause should get more flex hours. Things like that. It's a lot of it's just fiddling around, and it amounts to nothing really. And as a lefty, I find it frustrating. Yeah, I was willing to put up with a lot from the Blair government because they were left-wing and they did bring in some good stuff and they did increase public spending. And basically they were all right apart from the war. But Corbyn, I just don't know that he can get elected, and a lot of this doesn't seem particularly thought through, if you ask me, but what do I know? Trump's embroiled in yet another scandal, but this one seems like it has a little bit of meat on its bones. So he basically asked people in the Ukrainian government, to investigate Joe Biden and his son, and has confirmed and admitted that he did so. So when he talked to, how do you pronounce this, Volodymyr Zelensky, when he talked to him, he raised the subject of Joe Biden and his son with the Ukrainian president, and apparently pressured them to investigate Biden. I don't think that's necessary. I think Biden can lose all on his own, but it's still somewhat sinister, and it has fueled calls for the Democrats to launch impeachment proceedings, which they may already be doing under the emoluments clause. I've kind of lost touch because I have problems closer to home than Trump that are occupying my mind, shall we say. So Joe's son Hunter was a director at a Ukrainian natural gas company, while Uncle Joe Biden was vice president, obviously. So apparently Trump's hoping to get some dirt on Biden to use him if he ends up being the Democratic candidate from the Ukrainians, who might have some intelligence on him, since he's a foreigner who was in charge of a big company in Ukraine, and Ukraine is a bit of a flashpoint with Russia as well, which is kind of interesting. I think it takes away from the idea that Trump is some sort of Russian asset. I think he's just Trump. All he cares about is himself. All he cares about is winning, and that's all that really matters to him. I think Trump is the party of Trump. And that's an end to it. But this does seem dodgy, but a lot still isn't known, even though he's basically admitted to asking for it to be done. So I don't know. It's the trouble with Trump, and in terms of impeachment, I think, is he's done a lot of little bad things, or is implicated in bad things that have gone on, but there's nothing really directly attaching him to any genuinely bad thing. What he's doing is similar to what's going on in the UK, in that he is ignoring convention, he is ignoring tradition, he's ignoring the sort of handshake type stuff that keeps the wheels of politics moving, right? He's breaking all the implicit social contracts around politics, but not breaching the explicit contracts around politics. So it's outraging a lot of people. It feels like cheating and so on, but he's not necessarily done anything that's impeachable. Morning, Steve. I already covered the Labour conference, so when I'm finished, you can rewind back and look there. If anyone's got any comments or questions or anything, please do add them. I'll get to them at the end. I did cover this over the weekend, but I've had some more thoughts. So we've got this vape ban going on, or in the offing, in the States, because of these issues around people getting contaminated vapes and developing lung infections, popcorn lung, that sort of thing. It's a massive overreaction, because what is going on is that these people are buying cheap liquid, cheap cartridges, cheap whatever, from online, typically from China. And I found out today that a lot of goods coming in from China to the West aren't checked, because the Chinese government doesn't let people check them. So, this is a concern, I think. Stick to buying clothes from China and not much else. Maybe gadgets. But so the problem is this kind of grey market, black market, oils, liquids, vape fluids, whatever, juices, whatever you want to call them, particularly when it comes to cannabis vaping, and CBD oil vaping, things like that, because they've only got a kind of quasi-legal status, and federally cannabis products are still illegal, I think, which means importation is a bit of an issue. So yeah, it's all this black market, grey market stuff that isn't necessarily made to the full hygiene standards or checked properly and so on. And that's what's causing the problem. So what you should be doing is legalizing and setting standards for those, and creating some kind of mark, I guess, for certification or something for vape liquids to ensure that they're up to full food safety things. But however many people have gotten ill, right, it is nothing. It is absolutely nothing compared to lung cancer. And yeah, I don't smoke. I've never vaped. I've only done pot by eating it, and it never really agreed with me. But you do you, whatever. Banning it seems like a massive overstep, especially banning all the flavored juices and stuff, because adults can enjoy those, right? We stop kids buying cigarettes or alcohol. Just apply the same to vape liquid, even non-nicotine vape liquid, and there you go, sorted, really. But no, we've got to do this ban, and it's got to be coming from the tobacco companies, who have been slow to move into vaping, and many of whom are bringing in more tobacco-like products. So it's got to be them wanting to attack their opposition, and it's weird to see them playing up the risks, really, when they try to ignore it so much for cigarettes. But we don't have a legal ban yet. But what we do have are various sales points starting to remove vape products from their shelves. In the US, Walmart has started doing it. Now that's still a big deal, not as big a deal as if Amazon stopped doing it. But that's a storefront making a moral standpoint for its customers. Don't you miss when capitalism was capitalism? We can turn a profit from this, let's do it. And there was no moral question whatsoever. Sounds weird coming from a socialist, but I kind of miss capitalism and its completely amoral, not immoral, stance on a lot of things. Yeah. Walmart, they can't pay their workers enough. They won't let them unionize, but they'll take vapes away at the merest hint of a Becky asking to see the manager. Speaking of corruption in politics, it has emerged that Bojo might have some conflicts of interest. He's going to be dogged by scandal forever because he is a dodgy fellow, and he has done some dodgy things, and he's lied constantly throughout his career, and he's in large part responsible for the whole Brexit mess, even though that was really a cynical career move on his part. But yeah, obviously he's going to be under even more scrutiny now that he's Prime Minister. And there are claims that have come out from the Sunday Times, I believe, excuse me a moment, that he's failed to declare a conflict of interest in how money was given to a US businesswoman while Boris was the Mayor of London, which was a fuck-up from start to finish, quite frankly. Bring back Red Ken. Despite his anti-Semitism, he was a much better mayor. So Jennifer Arcuri, I think that's how you pronounce it, who's an entrepreneur associated with Mr. Johnson, joined various trade missions that he went on and was given £126,000 in public money. At the time, that must have been getting on for $200,000, to give you some idea. So nearly a fifth of $1,000,000. It's not small potatoes, really, even for entrepreneurs. And it's not entirely clear why she got that money and what it was for. And there's a whole lot of other dodginess around it, like the registered address on the grant application is a rented house that doesn't belong to her. What else is there? Another one of her companies won a £100,000 grant, so at current rates that's about $120,000 for English-based business. It basically looks like, under the table bribery and so on. She's also received another £10,000 in sponsorship money from a mayoral organisation when Johnson was in office, so that's closer to $15,000 at the time. And another $15,000 government grant for foreign entrepreneurs, again, at the same time. So it seems there's certainly a whiff of corruption there, but our political system is utterly fucked at the moment for obvious reasons that we brought up, but it's become obvious because of the whole Brexit thing and everything that's come to light through that. The courts are also screwed here. They don't like to interfere in politics, but the judiciary is supposed to be one of those balancing forces, right? You've got Parliament, you've got the judiciary, you've got the two houses of Parliament, and you've got the executive and the Prime Minister as the head of the executive. Yeah, and these different branches of government are supposed to balance each other, but at least in England, which means really for the United Kingdom as a whole, the judiciary seems very reluctant to get involved and to punish anybody for political shenanigans, even though that's part of their role. Traditionally, they haven't had to, and so they haven't for the most part. There are exceptions, obviously, especially in a country with as long and contentious a history as we have. But this is... we've got the Supreme Court ruling coming this week, probably. Almost certainly. And I'm worried that the English Supreme Court, the UK Supreme Court, I'm worried that they just don't want to get involved in politics. But if they let this slide, quite apart from the whole Brexit issue, it would mean that any government could prorogue Parliament at any time for any reason to prevent anything being discussed or scrutinised or countered before it goes through. And that has very big, bad, long-term implications for British democracy, far beyond recent issues about Brexit. So we would have to hope that Johnson loses the election if he wins the Supreme Court issue, and that any new government that comes in is principled enough to put a bill in place to make what he's done full on illegal and part of the British Constitution. So we'll have to hope that that's the case. Canuck, I'll get to you and everyone's questions and comments once I'm finished. But yeah, Bojo, everyone knows he's corrupt. It's just a matter of proving it and whether the courts will do anything about it. The Foreign Secretary has been on the Sunday shows yesterday saying that the government will abide by the Supreme Court's ruling, which again is supposedly coming this week. That's Dominic Raab. Too many A's. Contradicting what some other members of government, like I believe Gove, said that they might not abide by the Supreme Court ruling, which would be interesting because they'd have to be arrested, I think, sent to the Tower, or locked in the clock tower of Parliament, one or the other. But he said that the government is going to abide by it. So we've now heard both versions. Oh, we'll abide by it, we won't abide by it. We'll abide by it, but then we'll immediately prorogue Parliament again. We will follow the law, we won't follow the law. It was quite breathtaking to hear, cabinet politicians, members of the executive saying, oh, well, we won't do what the Supreme Court says. But now they seem to have walked that back. I don't think they know what they're going to do. So how can you trust them? Who knows? The thing is, all this wrangling is taking time anyway. So if they can, just by fighting it through the courts and making the courts take time to decide, right? Bojo's already won to an extent on that score, but we'll see this week, I suppose. Hopefully sooner rather than later. I can't see that it's that complicated a decision, but what do I know? I don't get paid Supreme Court judge wages. So with elections in the off, it's interesting to note that Facebook has suspended tens of thousands of apps off its store, or just off its Facebook ecosystem. This was reported on over the weekend. I think I did cover it a bit, but it's been a bit more specific now. So tens of thousands of apps have been taken off. All the apps were associated with about 400 developers who have a history of basically data scraping when you use the apps. And this all relates back to what Cambridge Analytica did, with their surveys and so on, to get people's data and access to their friends lists and all the rest of it, which they then used for those targeted grey area legality adverts. That were, a lot of them were outright lies. There's an old BBC News story about that you can go and see. But this was highly targeted ads on people to turn them against the European Union, essentially, if they were on the fence or wavering slightly or weren't completely against it already. And it's incredibly dodgy, and we still don't know the extent to which it went on. Facebook haven't revealed the full extent to which it went on. But this is part of Facebook kind of cleaning up their act ahead of whatever elections happen to be in the off soon. And after they were fined $5 billion by the US Federal Trade Commission, and after they were fined more money by other people, I think Europe fined them for violations of data privacy and so on. Yeah, there was a £500,000 fine for another data scandal. These things just go on and on and on. But it seems like they're trying to do something about that now to get rid of, well, you can never get rid of it all, but to minimise the impact on any forthcoming elections. That's good, but there is still an institutional bias at these social media companies. It's not just against right-wing or conservative viewpoints. It also affects a lot of left-wing views and viewpoints, or libertarian, or basically anyone straying past a certain point in any direction on the political compass is likely to be censored or have their accessibility reduced on any social media platform, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or wherever else. So that's still a concern. But at least they're tackling the outright corruption. So I'm gonna take that as a win, I think. Here's another interesting issue that kind of relates. The tech community, the tech entrepreneurs, are actually asking for more government regulation, which is a really weird, odd thing to see, right? And this is explicitly asking for it. So normally they've been kind of insular and resistant and have pushed back against any idea of government interference with what they're doing. But they've had all these issues, they've had all these complaints, there's all these lawsuits and fines and so on that have been levied recently. And so the attitude seems to have shifted. And why they don't want to just sort this out themselves, I don't know. Maybe they find it ideologically difficult, whereas if it comes down from government forcing them to make changes, maybe they'd be more willing to do it then. But then the trouble is, government is inherently partisan because it's whatever party happens to be in charge, and they'll make laws and decisions that they think will benefit them. So it's a rough old set of things. Maybe government enforcement by right-wing governments would balance with inherent bias more to the left, though these are redundant terms largely, and maybe that'll result in some sort of balance. I mean, we've seen Facebook say, we're a publisher now, because they want the right to censor anything on their platform. But that means they lose access to the safe harbour laws, which meant that they were not responsible for things that were put up on their platform. So if they're saying, we're publishers, now they're responsible. I think I was saying over the weekend that, okay, why would they do that? Why would they want to give up that legal protection? There is nothing theoretically to stop me going onto Facebook right now and spamming a bunch of child porn all over the site, other than that I wouldn't do that, obviously. But in theory, there's nothing there to stop me. But at the moment, right, Facebook bears no liability for me doing that if I did that. right? Because they're a platform, not a publisher, so they're not responsible for what other people put on the platform. It would be reported in short order, and whatever account I used to be terminated and so on, but it would still happen, but they would bear no responsibility. Whereas if they call themselves a publisher, and I do that, then they're responsible because they're seen as being having editorial control, right, and thereby tacitly approving of whatever I put up there. So they would be responsible for it, and so Facebook could then be sued for whatever trauma or issues or obscene publications or whatever it might be. So why would they want to call themselves a publisher? I suspect they want to call themselves a publisher and then have one of these cases come through where they get sued or whatever for whatever content someone has put up. Maybe someone live streams another murder or whatever, and Facebook gets taken to court because they're now a publisher. And I think they're then hoping that the court will then rule that they cannot reasonably be expected to control everything on their platform, even though they call themselves a publisher. And so I think they're angling to get the best of both worlds there. So I think that's what's going on. Because it would be true, if it was tested in court, that it is unreasonable to expect them to control everything posted on their platform, but that they should be able to deal with it and remove it and block it, whatever, in a timely fashion. But what's a timely fashion? What's a reasonable amount of time? What would a reasonable person expect to be their response, and how long would it be? How long would a reasonable period be? And reasonable is a legal standard that's pretty woolly, but it is a legal standard. So I suspect that's what's going on there. But a whole bunch of venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs and so on are asking for more regulation, like they can't regulate themselves or they're unwilling to. So they all started out with this kind of, what does he call it? Roger McNamee or whatever. Roger McNamee. He's an old tech entrepreneur, kind of from the pre-Jobs era, I guess. And he says Silicon Valley was founded on this kind of tech nerd hippie libertarianism, he calls it. So kind of left libertarianism. But as they've become immensely wealthy and so on, their ideals have taken a hit when they've had to encounter the real world, and their tools are being used in ways that they didn't anticipate. You would think they would, being reasonably intelligent people, but then maybe a lot of them are, hesitate to say it, but on the spectrum and not necessarily as good at reading societal reactions, emotional reactions and things. But he also says that their utopian ideals have been usurped by greed. So it's not just that the real world has bumped up against them, it's that vast sums of money and wealth have bumped up against them and made them turn aside from their goals. So he, McNamee, along with other people, is calling for the government to step in because these companies seem unable to regulate themselves, and that's in part that's why we see them abusing our data, and in part that's why we see them allowing other people to abuse our data and to corrupt democracy and so on. So he seems to think, and others, this is not just the one guy speaking out, they seem to think the only way we can get these companies to act ethically and to maybe move back a bit towards their original idealistic ideals is to have government step in and force them to. I've got some sympathy for that. I think regulation is important. It just depends how it all pans out, really. I would love for some kind of government to step in and say, okay, YouTube, you are a de facto monopoly over video and audio discussion online. You have a duty to protect the free expression rights of everyone, so we want you to stop playing favourites and all of this, and advertisers can suck a dick because the advertisers, they're still going to advertise on YouTube, and if they're legally prevented from enacting censorship, then YouTube can just say, look, if your stuff appears next to a nasty video, there's nothing we can do about it. Sorry, we don't have to do anything about it. The government says that we have to treat everyone on our platform fairly and equally. So tough, and I imagine the advertisers' moral quandaries would disappear pretty quickly then. Jorg Sprav and the YouTubers Union's meeting with YouTube Europe soon. I doubt we'll get anything useful out of that. Though they did back down over the whole verified debacle, so maybe YouTube's in more of a listening mood lately. We'll find out, I guess. The climate change protests. People kept asking me my opinions on this over the weekend. I'm always heartened to see that a lot of people care about an issue and get out on the streets, whether it's opposing Brexit or climate issues or whatever else. I'm always heartened to see that people care and want to make a change. I don't think protests accomplish anything. Not anymore. Governments just ignore them. They found ways to ignore them or make them irrelevant, or the media often doesn't follow them particularly closely. They did this time, but it's touch and go on that. And just the messaging seems so confused, and people keep trying to hitch the political wagon of something else onto climate issues. Now, like I've said plenty of times, all right, I'm pretty far left. I'm a left anarchist. I'm a pragmatic socialist. But I don't think we need to hitch socialism's wagon to green issues, particularly, or vice versa, because the Green Party quite often hitches their environmental issues to socialism. I'm talking about non-Marxist socialism, utopian socialism, democratic socialism here, which is something that I advocate for, but I don't think the two necessarily have to have anything to do with each other. I mean, when you work together as a society towards a common goal, and you centralize your efforts, you Manhattan Project that shit, that's when things get done, right? So a certain amount of collectivization and common effort and common cause and so on is needed to tackle climate issues. But the kind of shit that the American more extreme fringe of the Democrat Party, that's a weird phrase to come out of one's mouth, trying to hitch all of these other things on to the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal should be about innovation, it should be about technology, it should be about jobs relating to green issues, it should be related to cutting carbon emissions, all that kind of stuff. All this other stuff has nothing to do with that. So why? It's just going to make people suspicious and not want to make even the basic environmental changes that you want to make, right? And we're basically past the point where eating bugs and even reforestation is going to make that much of a difference. Though I am offsetting my carbon by planting about 150 to 200 trees, which I strongly suggest plenty of other people do. Really helps your guilt a great deal, and means more trees, and who doesn't like more trees? But we're at the point where we need technological solutions. There is no way that we are going to make a dent on climate change without more nuclear power, more fusion research, more wind farms, more tidal power. Hydropower isn't as good because it tends to involve flooding, and that can actually create a huge amount of carbon output as plants and so on die off and rot away. Creates a lot of methane and carbon dioxide. Modern concretes, however, for dams can be made that absorb carbon over their lifetime. So if you use modern concretes, that's better. Food, we can make changes, but convincing people to eat bugs is pretty much a non-starter unless you can make it unrecognizable. But we could do more with greening urban areas, vertical farming, rooftop gardens. Yeah, there's all kinds of small-scale practical stuff that lots of people can do. We could incentivize home working, right? That would cut down massively on car journeys and so on. If everyone can telecommute, and that's acceptable and that's encouraged, right, then that makes a huge impact. There's all sorts of stuff we can do, but they seem to all be focused on basically self-flagellation and so on. Carbon capture, that's something we can crack. Carbon sequestration, I can never say that fucking word right. Sequestering carbon, there we go, rephrase if you can't say the word. We can do technology to do that. There's more radical ideas like spraying reflective aerosols into the air, into the upper atmosphere. Because, what they call chemtrails, right, are actually contrails. Contrails from air traffic help actually to offset the warming caused by the fuel burned by jets. because the increased amount of cloud cover reflects more sunlight and helps cool the earth. So we could do something like that artificially. That's one thing that could work. Seeding the oceans with microscopic iron filings, essentially, that promotes massive algal blooms and plankton blooms. That's a massive carbon sink. Trouble is that has some side effects. There's been some testing, so you have to worry about that. But there's geoengineering. We could put shaders in orbit between us and the sun. There are technological solutions. We need to make changes, but we can't stop this with the kind of change that a lot of people are talking about, or insisting that everybody goes vegan, and it's just not going to work, and it's not going to sell. Like the Labour policies, right? You want someone in who's going to make a difference, but in order to get in, you have to appear reasonable. But this is a big issue, a big genuine issue. I am glad to see climate protests. I want it to translate into practical proposals and practical actions. And unfortunately, a lot of these climate people are against nuclear power, pro-veganism, shit that will never sell, and shit that's unnecessary self-flagellation. I don't think it rises to the level of a religion, which some people say, because it is rooted in evidence. But when it comes to what actions to take, I don't think they're being practical or reasonable. What else have we got? As it turns out, climate change is accelerating, by the way, according to the latest information. And the Germans are sending a big year-long research expedition to the Arctic called Polarstern, which is a big science vessel icebreaker they've got. So they're going to be doing a whole bunch of studies, but it does seem like things are accelerating faster than we anticipated. But we haven't yet reached that absolute tipping point, but we probably will soon. Once the methane hydrates go, we're fucked. I've never been so glad to be in the northern hemisphere rather than near the equator, because we're going to be somewhat insulated, but it's still going to be hard for us. Let's end on something more positive. NASA hasn't had any really truly huge rockets since the moon landings era, the Saturn V, but they've just finished primary construction on the main components for their new big rocket that's supposed to launch the what are they called? Orion, which is basically a scaled up version of the old Apollo modules, right? Which is really disappointing, because Orion was the code name for the nuclear thrust rockets that people came up with back in the 50s and 60s, which are pretty cool because they use bombs to fly, and that's awesome. If radioactive. So they've named this current new module Orion, and it's just kind of depressing to me that we're basically going back to exactly the same old technology. I guess it works. I guess in the same way that all cars have kind of ended up looking pretty much the same, sort of bubble cars, because that's the most aerodynamic shape, the most cost-efficient shape by and large. I guess that's why, so it makes sense, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The shuttle had all kinds of problems, so they've gone back to something reliable and just updated the technology and the scale and so on. So this is the new Space Launch System, not very creatively named. So they've just finished the main construction on the main part. It's got a more complicated, up-to-date engine. It's got new materials and so on. It's basically an upgrade of 50-year-old technology, which, I guess that's good. I just wish we had a little bit more vision. The same as with the climate issues. So they're going to send an uncrewed Orion craft to the moon, sending that around 2021, and then men should be back on the moon, all things, if everything goes well, back by about 2024. We can hope, I guess. So this is, the big rocket that's going to take us at least back to the moon, possibly to some asteroids and so on, and it'll be nice to see human beings out in proper space again in my lifetime, I guess. Just got to hold on another 4 years or so. It's just kind of disappointing. Still, I wish there was more vision. I wish more effort had been made to investigate like hybrid thrusters, things like that. So proper space planes rather than the shuttle. We've come a long way, and yet there's so very little vision. And private space enterprise, much as I love it, it's for profit. It's about launching satellites. It's not really about exploration. For that, you have to get the public involved. If we could somehow marry Elon Musk's innovation and efficiency to the vision and the mission of NASA, that would make me happier. I think I'd like to see a combination, but I neither trust private enterprise nor national governments with space exploration. But yeah, you got to pick one, unfortunately. Right, let's see what you've been saying. Rob McFarlane says, I suspect the Corbyn Politburo would unperson him if they could. That's when we were talking about Tom Watson. Well, they tried, but great leader said he liked having Tom around. So kudos to Corbyn for that, at least. Steve said, what were my thoughts on Labour and public schools? Yeah, I covered that earlier, but in principle I agree, in the same way that I would agree with removing private healthcare and putting the money that's spent on private healthcare back into the public NHS. Similarly, I would love to see all the money that goes on private schools being put into public schools to give everybody the best education possible. But in both cases, I don't think it's a saleable policy, and I think there's more important issues. Now, I live in the south of England. I may as well expand on what I said earlier. I live in the south of England. There are a lot of private schools around here. A lot of parents send their kids to private schools. Not so much at primary school age, but later on. There's a girls' school called Rookwood that's not far away. It's Winchester Boys College or something it's called. That's over in Winchester. There's a lot of private schools around, basically. And a whole bunch that I never knew existed for a long time because they're kind of worlds unto their own. They're also hotbeds of abuse, unfortunately. Private schools were allowed to slap students around longer than public schools were. And it does give people an unfair advantage in the same way that inherited wealth does. So the trouble is I just don't think it's a saleable policy. Particularly because the wealthier end of the country will be dead set against it and will be donating money to your political opponents and so on. And it's just not the most important issue right now. So I think that's a bit of an own goal, like a lot of their other stuff. Kanak says, what is the common take on the possible involvement of Prince Andrew in the Epstein sex scandal? There's a lot of deference to royalty in this country, but most of that is reserved for the Queen. Charles is a bit of a laughingstock. Andrew's mostly seen as a kind of irrelevance, though he has been a fairly active trade ambassador. The thing with Epstein is, just because a rich guy invited you to his island or whatever, because he likes being around famous or talented people, doesn't mean that you necessarily took part in whatever sexual shenanigans were going on. I mean, Stephen Hawking went there. He physically couldn't engage in any sexual shenanigans, right? Matt Groening went there. I don't think he's some kind of closet paedophile or whatever. Interestingly, I've had someone in my comments on my more atheism videos going on about how Lawrence Krauss went to the island, and other prominent atheists, skeptics, scientists, and so on went there. Well, Epstein was also heavily involved in transhumanism, and I've been helping out with the transhumanist party primaries, so that's come up a fair bit. But it's all guilt by association. Unless you can prove that someone did something, then as a skeptic, you have to say, no, I need evidence. So much as I am a small R Republican and want shot of the royal family, I don't know that Prince Andrew did anything. I'd have to see evidence that he did. He's always been a bit of a playboy for a chunky lad, but I don't think that means he's fucked kids. Should we put it that way? I need evidence, but it's plausible that he involved himself in some sexual shenanigans and so on. But the most likely explanation is simply that Epstein liked to surround himself with powerful, influential, famous, talented people. And that's for most people, I think that's just the explanation. Maybe he was trying to get compromat, to use the Russian term, on some people. But Andrew doesn't really have any meaningful power or anything, so I don't see why you'd bother, really. Innocent until proven guilty. Is that political repercussions question a follow-on to the Prince Andrew one, Canuck? Or is it an entirely separate question about something else I was saying? It doesn't seem to be having any political repercussions. Apparently, there is a plan to potentially get rid of the royalty as a political institution when the Queen dies. Apparently, there's a move to have Parliament say, okay, we are now just purely ceremonial and not political at all. That's really where we are now anyway. So it might bolster some support for that. I think mostly it's because, well, Charles is set to take the throne, right? And he's much more of a political activist. He's much more outspoken than the Queen ever has been. I think even smaller Republicans like me have a lot of respect for the Queen. You know, she mucked in during the war, learned how to repair jeeps and stuff. And she does have this kind of quiet dignity and class about her. But her children and her grandchildren and so on don't have that same kind of propriety, and they can't be trusted to hold a steady course. So I think even royalists are thinking that, okay, we had a good run with the Queen, good old Liz, but Charles doesn't look like a good bet. He's a bit loopy, bit of a hippie, bit of an activist. When he's king, he's likely to cause problems. And then we look to his kids, and due to what happened to their mother and so on, they're quite outspoken and activisty, just as she was. So I think they kind of don't want the boat to be rocked. And so I think if there's any knock-on, it will be that it will make that idea more popular, that we reduce the role of the monarch to one that's purely ceremonial and has no political bearing whatsoever. But we'll see, because on the other side of that is the fact that all of our other political institutions have been shown to be corrupt and not fit for purpose. And even though royalty is not much of anything, it does lend a sense of propriety and care to government. So, yeah, swings and roundabouts, but I suspect we'll see a move to become a republic, at least practically, if not in name, when the Queen pops her clogs. But we shall see. Yeah, she is a kind of ideal modern monarch. Like I say, even small R Republicans like me have to begrudgingly accept that Queen Liz is a class act. You know, we're new Elizabethans. I don't want to be Charlies. Or whatever you call charlatans. Who knows? Right, I should get on. I've got some actually interesting work to do. I've been working for triggerwarning.us. I should have some new articles up there soon. I'm trying to do more for that, but my gaming world and my article writing world have kind of collided with the idea of doing a sort of politics card game, party game Minecraft, which sounds like a lot of fun from the ideas that have been put forward. So I've got to turn people's brainstorming ideas into a game. So I'm going to try and do some of that today. All right, take care, everyone. Have a good one. Hope you all have a great week. I hope my week's better than the last couple of weeks. Love you all. Take care. Make sure to subscribe. Let people know about my streaming channel, which is this one, because it's not the same as my regular channel. And I can't really leave you without a zang. So zang. 2 screens, always hard to find. Harder to find my mouse pointer, I find. Later.